Back from entertainment. Entertainment is a focal point of many tourist trips. Entertainment can be any number of things from festivals, shopping, casino, nature tours, and cultural features. These attractions intersect well with our planning process and many of our spatial planning guidelines.
So next, we are going to talk about the key planning process elements that play a role in sustainable tourism. We'll be discussing 4 specific elements. The first element we're going to talk about is the approval process for planning permission. A key factor that contributes to facilitating the growth of the tourism sector is through the implementation of development supporting infrastructure. And this could be financial, but in this specific slide, we're going to talk about the built infrastructure. So Anya would have referenced accommodation earlier. Such as hotels, guest houses, bed and breakfast, or conversions from single family to multifamily homes and Airbnbs. Depending on the complexity of the proposals, the prospective developer is always encouraged to engage with the regulatory agencies at the conceptualization stage, which is often termed pre-application advice. The first port of call is the Town and Country Planning Division. And at this time, we would give guidance to the developer, the prospective hotelier, on whether they should submit for an outline planning permission or they can go straight to final. Outline gives guidance on the requirements and standards and policies, as well as other regulatory agency approvals that may be required to obtain the final permission. It's just essentially a guidance document valid for a year. It is the recommended route for developers unfamiliar with the construction permitting framework and relevant standards applicable in Trinidad. In some cases, as I mentioned before, the experienced developers would go direct to final planning permission once they accrue with the policies and standards. This process has long been established as a paper-based process, and it requires the applicant to physically come in to submit applications and seek appointments at the various regulatory agencies at various times. It is cumbersome, lengthy, and frustrating for the developer. In addition to that, Town and Country is not the only regulator responsible for construction permissions. We are just the first step, and they then have to go to the implementation bodies, such as the local authority, the WASA, fire, other government agencies to get further permissions. And all these government agencies appear to operate in silos from the end user. So the developers has to seek these permissions, usually physically at various offices. It could be very frustrating. So later, in a later slide, we will present the attempts to modify or improve the process to facilitate the ease of doing business and encourage development in the accommodation sector in tourism. The second key principle is the legal environment. The Town and Country Planning Act, Chapter 3501 of 1960, has essentially institutionalized land use planning as a central government function, with the local authority playing a part in the implementation aspect of the process. The Act is currently in the process of being repealed by the New Planning and Facilitation of Development Act, which was partially proclaimed in 2014. And this new act essentially seeks to promote the devolution in the planning process, allowing the municipal corporations or local authorities some level of autonomy in planning for their regions. It is a much more sustainable framework for the operationalization of the construction permitting process and would allow those bodies to, within the remit of their boundaries, to define more basic principles to encourage sustainable tourism growth as they see best fit.
A third element of the planning process is the preparation of spatial planning guidelines. What spatial planning guidelines are really is that they provide information and advice to planning and other design professionals and prospective developers and applicants for planning permission. In order to sell Trinidad and Tobago as a viable destination, we all agree that we must provide developers, including state agencies, with some level of guidelines as to how they should design, how they should build, how they should construct, right? The existing guide to developers that Trinidad and Tobago has was drafted in 1989, and it basically gives, like for instance, with the tourism industry, it gives basic standards for resort development and hotels. So recently we started preparing some spatial planning guidelines. We've done one for subdivision, we've done one for small lots. And what we found is that these new spatial planning guidelines will definitely carry developers through, because what obtains on the ground oftentimes is not what the current guide to developers could help persons with. So we came up with a number of SPGs that we need to be working on. These are in draft form still. Parks and squares, we know that a tourist, one of the main, and if we were to tie it back to the sectors and look at accommodation and entertainment particularly, parks and squares would cover that, park design and amenities, waterfront development. We have another presentation on waterfront development coming up afterwards. And we know that tourists, I know like when I go to Barbados, I run to their waterfront. All right, so you want to be able to plan your facilities and give standards and guidelines that would facilitate something that the tourists would want, that product that the tourists would want. Green corridors, I mean, given COVID, we know that the outdoors, it will impact health. So green corridors is one, of course, beach development, landscape design, and something, I don't know if there's anyone from the Ministry of Tourism here today in Trinidad, but cemetery tourism is a big deal. And with COVID, funeral homes, those things need standards, and we have been working to finalize those. Places of worship, you know that our country, Trinidad and Tobago, is a multicultural society. We have a number of ethnicities. So we are quite known for different churches, the Roman Catholic churches, big churches, Anglican churches. And of course, persons from India are also always looking at our temples. Persons from the East, the Middle East will look at our mosques, right? We also have one resort development that is a big thing, especially in the thrust of staycation. And then climate change, we ought to be able to plan our places in such a way that a tourist would want to come to a healthy, low sea level rise type of country. Granny flats and maid quarters is another one, and then green building construction. Public interactive streets, one of the examples that we put in our paper is that we want to be able to have a tourist come that would be looking for ease of connectivity and walkability. Tourists like to walk. I like to walk when I go abroad. All right. Spatial enclosures. We have to look at the street trees, the buildings that are close to the sidewalk to encourage more cautious driving, for instance. And then we come to microspatial policy review.
Microspatial policy review was newly implemented in the division in 2019. It refers to reviewing land use policy with the associated site development standards, which focus on small geographic areas within cities, towns, neighborhoods, blocks, or even linear corridors. As seen in this flowchart, it must be noted that the microspatial policy review can be initiated in a number of ways. If there are many requests for applications for planning permission, and the areas are not zoned for that particular activity, ministerial relief can also be a factor where developers and applicants appeal decisions made by the Town and Country Planning Division. A key trigger in the past has been trends in the extent and nature of unauthorized development.
So now we come to the Sustainable Development Initiatives. What we found is that our country being assigned to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and with us having a Vision 2030, we saw that tourism was captured in all the SDGs, in that it would be able to help us achieve those SDGs. So no poverty, gender equality, etc., etc. One of the things that tourism will do is it will create employment. So recently we had a big employment drive with the cruise ship industry, where over 2,000 persons from Trinidad were able to find jobs on the Royal Caribbean. So we know that tourism will be able to cover that sustainable initiative, where we will have more sustainable jobs, for instance. Local tourism is also another aspect of it that we know that, especially if you look at the legal environment that Ms. Gishad spoke to before, where we would have the municipal planning authorities coming on stream with the new legislation, there would be local tourism in each geographic region that the country has. So we thought that the Sustainable Development Initiative here would be looking at our local tourism plans, for instance.
We spoke about the planning approvals process earlier. It's been paper-based and chaotic, involving many stakeholders operating almost in silos, causing the user, the applicant or developer, to have quite a frustrating experience. So another initiative that has come across the board in terms of the construction permitting process in Trinidad and Tobago has been the transformation of that paper-based process to an automated platform called Develop TT. Supporting this process has also been the digitization of all the paper-based records, specifically to the TCPD at this point, Town and Country Planning Division at this point, to make that regulatory process of approving and reviewing plans easier. The user or the applicant will now be able to submit their applications online to the division as the first point of call, and then track their application through its process to the completion stage from anywhere in the world. So the objective is that a developer, like a hotelier, should be able to submit and receive approvals without necessarily needing to physically enter the space of the regulator or even the country. We hope in the near future. And the end result of this is to facilitate the ease of doing business and thereby attract more foreign investment into the country, and to facilitate that growth of the tourism structure by encouraging that sort of ability to receive approvals easier in the construction permitting process. So what the process now looks like for the end user, the developer that is that when they submit online to Town and Country, they have, it's a GIS-based platform. They have access to the entire process throughout the system from beginning to end. On the regulator side, we are able to correlate or cross-references or site inspections, and based on this one platform, we can see our previous planning decisions. The developer can also see the history near their site, the history of applications, approvals, refusals, etc. on their site. They are able to see the land use policy, which was something of a challenge in the past, having to come into Town and Country to get someone to be able to tell you what is the policy, what standards may be permitted. They can now see that online as they submit their application. But what is an important feature of this process is the platform now incorporates all the regulators. So it starts with the Town and Country Planning Division, but the regional corporation and the implementers are also on board in the system. We have the WASA, which is Water and Sewage Authority, we have the fire services and all those other regulators. So that from the regulator perspective, we can have these collaborative conversations and consultations with the other regulators on a project without having to write these copious letters, await responses. And it's the end result is to make the system and the process a little less time consuming and a little easier for the developer.
As I mentioned earlier, one of the initiatives was grants for the tourism sector. Persons desiring to develop must pass through a thorough assessment before the application for the grant can be approved. This will be dependent on proposals for the development meeting legal land use standards, and it will involve the developer coming to Town and Country for advice at the conceptual stages.
One of the last initiatives that we looked at has to do with smart cities, and we felt as though as a sustainable tourism initiative, a smart city would attract more tourists, right? We have enough data that shows that a smart city would contribute to economic development. It does assist with career advancement, especially for urban citizens, and they are 3 times as likely to benefit as their rural counterparts, and this is sustainability. So one of the examples is that we have the Port of Spain Revitalization Program, and under that program, we are looking to make Port of Spain a smart city, and so we will have little innovative hubs where you can access Wi-Fi freely, etc., etc. And we also have other areas in the country that are looking to go that way. So for instance, the First Peoples of Arima, they are now looking at doing their smart city project in the borough of Arima, and they are coming to us for assistance with that. We also had in the past the education city where UE is. So We thought that that smart city initiative would help with tourism because we have, besides the tourists that is coming to play carnival or for entertainment with our steel pan, etc., we thought that there would be some tourists that would come and look for things like that innovation that is taking place in the different countries, especially in Trinidad. So that is just the last initiative in a nutshell. And just to conclude, that we are looking to have responsibly planned and managed tourism, and this will demonstrate that it has the capacity to create job creation, promote inclusive social integration, protect natural and cultural heritage, conserve biodiversity. We are looking at our SPGs as a promise in a visionary step, and this will help with our transformation. And in the context that planning is going through a transformation period right now, our SPGs will contribute towards helping with that. Just to say in a nutshell that this is good for the ease of doing business for persons wishing to contribute towards development in the country, and by extension, help to promote the tourism industry. And that is our presentation, and we hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, ladies. Due to the time constraints that we have, I will continue with the second presentation. Cultural resource management for historic buildings and sites in the Anglo-Caribbean, a case study of UNESCO historical beach town and its garrison, done by Stacia Bryan. Stacia is a postgraduate candidate at the University of West Indies Cape Hill campus in the Department of History and Philosophy. She holds a MA in Culture Industries Management from the University of Greenwich, London. Since her return to Barbados, she has worked with the National Cultural Foundation Barbados from 2007 to present in the capacity of Business Development Officer and Festival and Event Planner. Ms. Bryan has had the privilege of working on the Barbados Crop Over Festival with events such as ceremonial delivery of the last Keynes Junior and Grand Cadoment, and it's currently a committee member of the Season of Emancipation. During the COVID pandemic, she was the lead producer of the document drama Josiah, Barbados Carolina's story, and over the past year, she has been member of the jury for the selection of installation artwork on the Golden Square Freedom Park. May I invite you to give your presentation? She's in the room with us, so that's the next level.
Good morning. Hi, how is everybody doing? Great. Welcome to Barbados. Yes, my name is Stacia Bryan, and I am a PhD student with the University of the West Indies Cape Hill campus in the Department of History and Philosophy. And I also work at the National Cultural Foundation here. A lot of my work deals with the festival and events of the country, and work under the Division of Culture in the Prime Minister's Office. My research looks at a topic, an area called cultural resource management. And I'm here today because in a nutshell, most planning goes on without us, the creatives, the ones who, when it's all over, we need to go in and have festivals, activities, events, create spaces for cultural consumption. And then we get there and there are like trees in the way, and there are light poles, and there are all kinds of different things that cause some challenges. So the context of cultural resource management is to assist us and you to open up a dialogue that you can see some of the challenges that we face. And hopefully from the conceptual and planning perspective, we can kind of mitigate some of those challenges in the first phases of planning. So I'm just gonna start, and we're gonna end the presentation with a little bit of an example of some of the work that we've been doing in the heritage sites throughout the COVID pandemic. So my outline today is very basic. I'm gonna look at defining cultural resources, again, from our perspective as creatives and cultural practitioners, looking at the historic buildings and sites within the historic UNESCO UNESCO Historic Bridgetown and its garrison, explain the framework that currently exists within Barbados for cultural resource management. And I'm going to look at just one of the properties, the Old Spirit Bond. This would have been a project that would have been restored by the Barbados Tourism Investment, Inc., and discuss some of the challenges we face in terms of access and usage, and of course, the overall wider challenge, which looks at managing historic buildings, the challenges facing either profiting or preserving such spaces within small island development states such as Barbados. And we'll just go look at some conclusions, some key lessons, and I'm hopeful that this allows us to have a little bit of a discourse, because some of, like I said, some of the challenges we face, we find because we're some of the last people think about, planners particularly. When we get there, we now have to face ourselves with how do we work in these spaces. So again, this is the purpose of the study, to re-examine the UNESCO World Heritage Property from the perspectives of CRM, to contribute to the enhancement of the property. Of course, when you're dealing with your heritage sites, where we want to maintain the outstanding universal value for why we got the site in the first place, but we also have to look at the themes of access, usage, preservation, stewardship. And a lot of my theories and strategies that I've worked with over the last 15 years with the National Cultural Foundation are housed in cultural industries management, where we do approach planning from the perspective of business and development from the creative sector. So we would look at cultural industries management strategies and heritage management strategies. The purpose of the research at this stage is to look at employing creativity. At the end of the day, we want job creations in the sector, and the planning approach to the space that would allow us to revision some of these spaces in the historic landscape in order to increase audience development, its interpretation. Of course, we're working within a contested space, the colonial past, and now the contemporary space in which, in the post-independence era, we as creatives and Barbadians and in this region have to understand, when you go into these spaces now, what is it that you're actually selling to the visitor or the audience? And of course, specifically creative product design with visitor management. What is it that, what stories are we going to tell? How are we going to represent ourselves? And when we do get these visitors, how are they going to consume the space? So the study argues that these colonial sites can be reinterpreted in this era for social and cultural development in Barbados. For me, particularly the study that I'm doing, I'm looking at the military history, maritime, and cultural heritage of the space. I believe my colleagues at BTI will take you on a walking tour later of the city, and you have an idea on a physical idea of seeing some of the projects that we've done on island. That's me. So in a nutshell, our guru, as we call it in cultural resource management, is a gentleman, Thomas King, and he looks at it from the perspective of those aspects of the environment, both built, physical and intangible, both natural and built, that have the cultural value of some kind to a group of people. We tend to have a lot of conversations in the Caribbean about what is culture, whose culture, multiculturalism, ethnicity, and these things. But in context of cultural resource management, we recognize that it is defined by a group or a community of people, a neighborhood or tribe, or scholarly or not scholarly disciplines that tend to look at spaces from a very particular type of perspective. So for me, the idea is I represent persons like archaeologists, architectural historians, folklorists, and cultural anthropologists, because when we view the space from its historical significance, its usage, its access, and how we're going to interpret in terms of audiences, visitors, commuters, and so on. So I'm a fun girl. I like to know who I'm speaking with. So I have a little bit of a slide here that helps me to understand who's in the room. So if by a show of hands, you could just let me know who I'm talking to, so we kind of have an idea of where I can carry the conversation. Any politicians in the room in terms of administrators? No? Okay. Property owners? Developers? Planners? Okay, we have all planners. Any historians? No. Archaeologists? Architects? Anthropologists? No. Visual artists? Okay, so if you are in 3 categories. All right, so you're a developer, you're an architect, and you're a visual artist. So I love you. We need to talk. Writers, dancers, and my audience online, yes. Writers, dancers, and filmmakers. So already you look at the perspective. And you can see yourself in 3 categories. So your viewpoint, your vantage point of looking at the space will be skewed in a particular direction. So too would be mine, because I'm a historian. I am not a property owner in the city yet, and I believe I'm a filmmaker based on some of the work I've done. So this is why I wanted to create the paradigm, the perspective that you're looking at the space. And in looking at the space, we then can delve into how we use it, the access to preservation, the creative product designs, and the way that we use it for job creation. So cultural resources, we make it up as the perception of what the environment looks culturally. You as planners look at a space particularly, we look at the space slightly different as cultural practitioners. And effectively, I'm seeing it from the perspective of social institutions and the beliefs. Some people don't like to go to certain heritage sites because of its colonial past. However, for people like us who are looking for spaces, i.e. galleries, theater spaces, open parks and so on, we have to look at it from a potential use of being able to earn a living. So some of the challenges and barriers that some audiences may have, or developers or so may have, we tend to have to push through those barriers because we are looking for some place to work. So managing cultural resource management in our context depends on the legislative frameworks, the management plans, regulation, the executive orders that govern and manage and protect cultural heritage. So for in our example, the UNESCO site, there will be the management plan for historic Breakout and its garrison. And of course, we can look at what we define as these resources that we're going to be looking at, the monuments, the groups of buildings, the sites. For me, my research looks at historic buildings and sites from the perspective of not only restoring for the purpose of cultural planning buildings, but also the wider environment in which it impacts, so that it affects cultures, it affects groups of people, it affects communities. And we have an idea from a wider perspective of how the site itself can help us develop in the culture and creative sector. So this is the legislation. I will not have to go through all of it, but we in Barbados manage our cultural resource, i.e. the UNESCO site, through many executive orders, the legislation and the management plan, the Cultural Industries Development Act, the management plan for UNESCO, Historic Breakout and its garrison, the Town Planning Act, the Physical Development Plan, the COVID-19 directives that we would have received throughout the pandemic, and of course through the departments and agencies that allow us to work within the space. So for example, the Division of Culture, the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, the National Cultural Foundation, and the Barbados National Trust are all NGOs who, within the context of the UNESCO management plan, the Historic Breakout and its garrison management plan, are all agencies that work together in terms of what actually happens and goes on, monitoring and evaluation of the site. And of course, this is guided by the researchers and of the University of the West Indies, independent researchers, and responses based on crisis or disaster conditions within the site. Again, this is just a framework if you want to have an idea of how we access and how we, in terms of looking at the site, how it's protected. And for me, cultural resource management, I call it the job. I call it the job from the perspective of working in the environment, working as a festival events planner, working as a producer, who, when we go into this space, you have to be mindful of the legislative framework that is protecting the space that you're working with. So our job really is to analyze the strengths and weaknesses of the framework and offer our expert opinion based on research on how we should approach sites such as UNESCO site and other historic buildings and properties across the island. So just for a case study, because there are many restoration projects happening right now in the city. This would have been one that happened in 2001, I believe. The Spirit Bond Wharf Road in Bridgetown. Actually, we are in a restored building site, which is the Exchange Museum. And if you ever get the chance to go on the second floor, there is this is usually used as a room for temporary exhibitions. The National Independence Festival of Creative Arts, NIFCA, has used this room that we're in right now. And then there's a permanent exhibition on the second floor that you should take in from the financial center. So we look at CRM. I'm going to borrow from my dear colleague here in the architectural world in terms of looking at it from the perspective of a building considered as architecture. Any buildings are preserved because they're culturally and historically significant in some way. Significant to a group of people, significant to their current cultural context, significant because of their location. We can go down the gamut on reasons why we look for historical significance. So in terms of CRM, we try not to go so far down into why it is historical significant. We establish that it is historically significant. And then we look to see what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, how can we reuse the space and plan for it better. So the Old Spirit Bond, dated back to the 18th century, was used as one of the island's major warehouses for rum. In terms of export, it's located near the Careenage, and it was convenient to boats stopping along the wharf side to load barrels of rum. And in 2001, the building was restored and adapted for use as a shopping center. At this point, there are not a lot of businesses currently in this space because of COVID and so on, some moved out and what have you. But again, it's used as an exhibition space, it is used as a research center, and it is a building that once you are in the city, you should visit because of its historical significance. So as a case study, if I look at the Old Spirit Bond and look at the reasons why we do CRM, and how we adapt it for planning. Access is one of our biggest challenges. Who owns the building, who grants permission, who allows you to go inside, do what you need to do. Usage, what is it currently being used for? The activities that enhance its integrity. And again, look at integrity, because we are working within the context of a UNESCO site, you do not want to have any damages to the property at any cost. And planning what happens? How does it change? Does the society require the use of the building to change in the current cultural context? For example, if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, when a lot of the schools would have been closed and we converted to online learning, some of the schools were then used as centers for testing and so on. So in the current cultural context, yes, it is a school, but what is the building used for at that point? Preservation is the what for us. What do we protect? Preservation as a verb, as opposed to just wondering why we're protecting it, is an action being undertaken, challenged, not just to preserve the building, but to understand the building and its wider environment. And stewardship, which is largely a problem across the board for all types of heritage locations and sites and so on, which is funding and restoration, resource management. How do we get it done? So for me, we look at CRM and architecture in terms of it being a case study, therefore pushing past the idea of not being able to use these spaces. This particular slide really looks at it and puts it in a context of it being a box. And if you're disassociating colonial past and these things from a site and looking at it from its usage and its access, then we consider it a box. What is the box used for? Does it have four walls? Does it have a roof? Does it have a floor? Now that we're in this space, why are we using it, and how do we interpret the historical significance of a space in order to continue its use? And again, because if we consider buildings as containers for human activity, when the humans leave and there's no more activity in the building, this is where we find that the structures and so on are damaged, and they're left derelict, and they get damaged through hurricanes and so on. What are we using it for? And as I said earlier, throughout the current COVID pandemic, closure of buildings, this particular concept was highlighted when persons were no longer going to physical spaces for work, no longer going to physical spaces for school, no longer going to meetings and so forth. So you find yourself now in the post-pandemic time of looking at buildings from a very different perspective. Do we really want to go back into a tall 5-story office room where persons are no longer working in that capacity, but now for us as the creatives and in the creative context, we might be able to use that building for another reason, another purpose, and so forth. So the building as a box, very simply, how does it work? How does it stand up to weather? How do we keep it out? How is it organized? What is it made of? And where has it been? How has it changed? Again, going in for the purpose of exhibitions and so on, reclaiming a space, we may need now to change the interiors for hanging of exhibitions, lighting, temperature control rooms, and these things. So what are we protecting and managing? The appearance of the building change provides a shift from the isolated building as an artifact to its current cultural context, and what is the relevance of the building in its current cultural context. So for us as academic artists, as we call them, we wish you to employ a little bit of creativity into your systematic integration of planning for these sites. Cultural resource management is a tool that we use in terms of planning. Consider the end user with the platforms of delivery that we need: exhibition galleries, concert halls, parks, open spaces, when we are re-examining or revisioning spaces, particularly for heritage buildings and sites, towards the increased visitation and value to the communities. Because of course, when you now go back into a space after it has been, after you've not used it and it's a space that is either in need of restoration and so forth, how better, and I like the idea of better planning, can we go back into this space now and use it and increase the consumption of it for the wider community, for artists, for product design, and so forth. And this slide, this particular point is one that, even working on some of the restoration projects before, and in my recent history working on the Golden Square Freedom Park, things as simple as access to water, electrical supplies, parking, backstage, dressing rooms, venue command center, event services, audience services, visitor comforts, within the overall planning approach to those types of spaces makes a difference for us. So for example, something as simple as where you position a light pole in terms of a line of sight for someone who's a sound engineer to see a stage is a big deal. And in terms of us coming in at the end of the planning and at the end of the redevelopment and saying, okay, we have to put on a performance in here, but now there's a pole in the middle of the stage. Columns in spaces that you consider stages, but of course I can't ever position a dance group on that stage because there's a column in the middle of it and so on. So those types of very simple things that if some level of discourse is happening with the creative sector, we can help mitigate some of the challenges in the post-planning stage. We go in now and we want to actually use it, how better we can use the space in terms of its sustainable usage. So to continue going to the Spirit Bond evaluation, just for example, what is the current use of the building? We go in and we will, in terms of our cultural resource management framework, we will look at documenting its current condition, qualifying its visitation and the effects of human interaction, offer recommendations towards its effective usage, suggest a preservation policy for the further uses of the building, and provide a report to its relevant stakeholders. Because this is what, in terms of doing cultural resource management for these types of sites, this is what our job really is. And the challenges of the profession, determining what the resource significance is and why, establishing what should be preserved and why, and in consultation, deciding how to preserve the objects and doing it. And the group activity, as you're going to do later, is to do a tour of the city, but have an idea of the historic sites and how you can add on the cultural products that we would wish to have consumed in these spaces once you've planned for them. And of course, review historic buildings and sites for cultural product design. For us as a community of people trying to work in this space, lots of the times what we would wish to do is still not possible because we weren't consulted in the beginning stages of planning. So I have here a very short example of what the possibilities are. As a producer for the National Culture Foundation, I had the privilege of working on a docudrama called Josiah, a Barbados Carolina story. And it was particularly because between 2020 and 2021, our department had to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic in two ways: still create work for our creatives on island, as well as go digital. And I am trained as theater. I was never trained in film, but it was now a medium that we had to adapt to in terms of delivering information and creating job employment for creatives who would have been knocked out of work throughout the pandemic. And this production was done with the National Culture Foundation and Mervyn Lynch Productions in terms of its technical support. And for us, it allowed the National Culture Foundation to employ over 50 or 60 actors, dancers, script writers. We had to engage with many historic sites. So in terms of access, having an idea of how property owners and so want to be represented in docudramas such as this, having the access in terms of times in, times out, managing the properties and recognizing that you can have access, but again, you don't want to damage the integrity of the spaces and so forth. And the production allowed a wider approach to seeing how heritage wants to plan for the creative product. It is a good example to see advertising and so on of the country based on the content that we were able to unearth. So I have a very short trailer, I think it's just about a minute long, of Josiah that can give you an idea of how we as creatives, once we have access to understanding, planning where we are going to use spaces, how we can get access, use preservation and creative product design, what is actually possible. So here's Josiah.
We must petition the king for a breath, rich and fertile body.
So within that production, I think we used at least 8 heritage sites, and we would have used the historic Bridgetown as Garrison site for some of our B-roll footage. We would have used the Colleton House in St. Peter. We used George Washington House, which is also within the context of the historic site, downtown Bridgetown, and many other locations that would have tied the story together. Of course, the Barbados Carolinas connection, Barbados and the North and South Carolina has a very rich history. So that particular production would have been built out of some of the work of the National Culture Foundation from the previous year, where we then use that content to employ creatives throughout the time. So if I conclude, based on all of what I'm talking about, planning for culture, use of space, understanding the nuances of cultural products, and widening the interpretation of spaces, we have to look at our legislative framework in terms of the protective framework for these cultural spaces. Access, of course, as I said, is determined by the property owner, the relevant stakeholders, the usage of the space determined by the cultural climate, planning, vision or future use of the building or the sites, preservation, protection, and the integrity of the cultural resource, and stewardship providing us for, provides report for funding and projects for investment. I really would like you to do the walking tour this afternoon, because it will give you a better idea of some of the work that has been done. For example, as I said, the Golden Square Freedom Park that was recently completed last year, and a lot of the physical planning that has been happening in Bridgetown to increase the visitation of the space. For us as creatives, as I said, we vision the spaces slightly different, and we want to be a part of the conversation so that we can add value to these properties, not only for external visitors, tourists to the island, but for locals and local cultural consumption. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacey. Now we have 9 minutes left, so I think that we can take 2 questions for Stacey and 2 questions for the team of Aisha. We will take questions in the room here, in the physical room, but there are also people in the virtual room. So if you do have questions, please raise your hands and then we can take the question. We have 1 question here. For who do you have? We have 2 questions here. Okay. So you can introduce yourself and ask the question. Yeah, you can use the mic. Yeah.
So good afternoon to everyone. I want to thank the 2 presenters for their very inspiring discussions about cultural heritage, which is the one we heard there, and also the one on sustainable tourism. I'm Dr. Nicole Greenwich. I'm from SEDEMA, which is the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. I didn't see myself fitting into any of the groups, Stacia, when you presented earlier, but I do have a question for you. And I also have a question for the team from Trinidad and Tobago. So my question to Stacia, you mentioned about being guided by crisis and disaster conditions when you look at a site. So I just wanted you to talk about what you mean by that. And then also too, we recognize that in disaster management, particularly with earthquakes, and then we can have destruction from storms as well, cultural heritage can definitely be affected. So how are you considering resilience, you know, in terms of when you talk about conditions, disaster conditions, does it come into that category there? And then my question to the team from Trinidad and Tobago on sustainable tourism, you also gave some guidelines about what you consider when you're looking at, you know, the buildings and so forth. You talked about 1989 guidelines and other guidelines, but you mentioned about climate change, but I didn't hear anything about disaster risk management guidelines that are considered. So I'm thinking, of course, they probably are, but I just wanted to know, you know, what kind of guidelines are being considered, because certainly we do recognize that, you know, when we look at Dorian and how it affected Bahamas, you know, certainly we do have to consider disaster risk management when we look at guidelines for our buildings and as it relates to planning. So I'm interested to hear your feedback, and thank you very much.
Okay, who's going first? Which group is going first? Stacia? Yeah.
It's interesting that you've asked that question
A
because,
brief answer.
sorry?
A brief answer.
Sorry, very brief. Interesting you asked that question because my actual study is on the Bucenas Fort. And in terms of the damage that's at that property since Hurricane Elsa, the entire roof is off one of the buildings. That has significantly restricted our use of that space. But for us, in terms of our planning, we, as a CRM person, normally rely on the resources of other experts, the engineers and the architects and so on, because obviously when you go into spaces now, from the perspective of reestablishing for creative sector planning, well, yes, we want them to be galleries and theater space and so on. We do need the guidance from those who are experts in that field in terms of restoring buildings and so on. So we tend to obviously lean on the architects and the engineers and so on in terms of rebuilding and reciting sites. Then in terms of its execution and our planning, whenever we go into sites, as I said, speaking as an officer of MCF, we would technically then have to do these sites based on the support services. So we have to do the site visit plans and so on. But in terms of legislation, these are things that we want to actually build out now or recommend that, that in terms of how these sites are protected once restored would be one of the recommendations going forward that we would want to be included in terms of its protective legislation.
Okay, thank you, Stacia. Team Aisha, are you ready to answer the question?
Yes.
Hi, so speaking to the question about disaster risk and mitigation, we currently sit on a committee that deals with the Sendai framework, and that is reporting on our mitigation and disaster risk management. And we're taking a lot of what we're learning within that committee to filter into our future spatial planning guidelines. I hope that speaks to what you asked.
We also have a spatial planning guideline in draft for climate change, which will also look at that as well. We've also been a part of the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Committee that is looking at the energy efficiency in buildings, commercial and residential. Those things are still in draft. So eventually you would see publications when they're completed, but we would be considering the effect of disasters on how we develop.
And in terms of coming down to site-specific development, the country is currently reviewing the national building codes or updating the national building codes. But in our application processes, we are currently liaising with the other agencies and looking at floodplain areas and what mitigating building practice we can implement in terms of our guidelines for development as it pertains to floodplains especially. Because, for instance, most of Trinidad, most of where the build development is in Trinidad and Tobago is on a floodplain. So we experience high incidence of floods with every rainy season. So our strategy currently is to update the spatial development guidelines, but also to look at our building practices and building codes as it pertains to individual development on the ground.
Okay, thank you, ladies. Are there more questions? Do we have one question here in the room? Can I invite you to ask a question?
Thank you. I am Simone Landucci. I work for Open Plan. I'm an urban planner. So we've been working in the Caribbean in different islands. I have a question for Stacia about heritage sites. In our experience in the Caribbean, especially in Nevis and in St. Vincent as well, whenever an heritage site is in private property, there is a perception that it needs to first get into government hands, and then any form of heritage protection can be done. And there is an interest towards collaboration with the private owners to develop some form of cultural use, but kickstarting those processes is very complex. So if you could elaborate on a bit on how the planner department will work. Yeah.
So my slide about the protection policies would be the legislation, but the NGOs. Our sector here is very much collaborative. So our Barbados National Trust usually would be that agency that would engage with private property owners and development plans for open houses and so on. They have a program that they run every year throughout the winter season, tourist season, that allows for visitors to the island and locals to go in at least I think it's one every Wednesday for about 6 or 8 months. And you're able to tour these various properties across Barbados. So our interconnected type of management structure, which allows for collaboration, is how we would address that problem.
Okay, so I think we don't have much time left, so I won't give a wrap up. But I have a final question for both groups. If you can for the conclusion, if you can specify one or two things that needs to be happened in order for your work to be fully implemented. Maybe we can start with Trinidad first. Are you able to answer? Do you want to answer the question?
Sure. Well, basically, we have as an immediate project to complete our spatial planning guidelines because they are just in draft. We want to do some more research with some of the regional planners and find out what is trending on the ground so that we could put some research into what are some new relaxed standards as some of our stakeholders say for, for development. They've been asking us to relax some of our standards. So I guess we need to do a little more research with that. And that will be an immediate item of work. Also, I don't want to pass it over to Ms. Kisha.
With regard to the automation platform developed TT, it was recently extended to the last regional office in Trinidad. So all of Trinidad is now fully automated in terms of the initial stages of the process. We are continuing to work with the consultants to try to get all the regulatory agencies on board. Not all of them are on board at the moment. So that is what we are working towards, getting all the other implementation agencies fully on board, and then also to bring Tobago onto the online platform as well. So that's the stage we're at. But it's progressing. So we hope that within the next couple of years, the system will be fully automated across the board over all the agencies.
And with regards to the microspatial policy review, that is more of an ongoing element that we continuously do, where we're reviewing policies and standards on a continuous basis, both in Trinidad and Tobago. So we will just keep on moving in that direction and doing as many reviews as we can.
And finally, the implementation of the legislation. We have a new planning legislation that we're supposed to implement. So all those things are fully proclaimed. So all those things are what we need to get our work implemented. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you, girls. Stacey.
I'm going to sing the same song, legislation, effectively is what we do need, and further consultation with the stakeholders when preparing for disaster planning for particularly heritage sites. Of course, if you think about the priority list of things that happen when a hurricane is coming, going and standing up next to a monument might not be one. So the idea of where it falls within a national development plan and how what kind of agency would be implemented for that particular type of preservation planning. So that would be the route I would like to go.
Okay. Thank you, ladies. Thank you, everyone. I think with those answers, we come to the end of this session. And also, especially thank you for your patience with the difficulties we have. Enjoy the further CUF sessions. Thank you.